The court's in session.
Okay, everyone, if you have your seats. Okay. Quiet, please. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. To most of the people in this room, this gentleman needs no introduction, but Bob Mueller is an independent researcher, genealogist, writer, reenactor, and tour guide, and much more, living in St. Genevieve. He's a member of the Milice de Saint-Geneviève, Les Amis, Missouri Preservation, and the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. He has been a trustee of the State Historical Society of Missouri since 2006 and has served on its executive committee since 2009. In 2023, he was elected to the board of the directors of the Center for French Colonial Studies. He is a past president of the Foundation for the Restoration of St. Genevieve, coordinates the Foundation's annual history conference, and is a member of the Foundation's Speakers Bureau. Please help me welcome Bob Mueller, who will present St. Genevieve's Senator Louis Linn, the handsomest man in Missouri.
Thank you. So one of the things I've learned over the years is don't speak late in the day and don't speak after a speaker that just did a heck of a presentation. This presentation was previously named The Life and Afterlife of Louis Fields Linn. It wasn't a very attractive and coming kind of lecture, so I changed it to The Handsomest Man in Missouri. And he was called that. So Louis Fields Linn was born in 1795 near Louisville, Kentucky, and he died here in St. Genevieve in 1843 and is buried in Memorial Cemetery a couple of times. He took a short sojourn into Cresslawn Cemetery for about 30 years before he came back. This is one of the few pictures, paintings we have. So this painting of Louis Fields Linn was done by Sarah Miriam Peale, the niece of the famous portraitist Charles Wilson Peale. So he had a pretty remarkable, distinguished family tree. His mother was Nancy Ann Hunter, born in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. She was remembered for her courage and conduct at Fort Jefferson, at the Iron Box in 1781, when Native Americans attacked and she helped repel them. Thomas Hart Benton, the senator, said, "Women and boys were men in those days." Those are fighting words now, but it was a nice compliment back then. In 1782, she married Israel Dodge in Carlisle. Now, he was from Canterbury, Connecticut. He had joined the Revolutionary troops at the age of 15, fought at the Battle of Brandywine, where he received a bayonet wound, and by the end of the war, he was a first lieutenant. He came to Kaskaskia on the east side when his brother was named Indian agent under George Rogers Clark. And then in 1788 moved across the river here to St. Genevieve. He was our first sheriff in the district of St. Genevieve. His son would become the second sheriff. But he and Nancy Ann Hunter divorced in 1790. But before that, they had produced a truly remarkable son named Henry Dodge. And I'll talk about him in a little bit. In 1792, she marries a guy named Ashael Linn at Louisville, Kentucky. Now, Ashael was descended from a guy named William Linn, who was very famous during the Revolutionary War. Before he got to the Revolutionary War, when he was young, he and 3 other boys were skating on the river on the ice near Louisville when they were taken prisoner by the Shawnee Indians. They were carried off, detained as captives for 3 years, and then made their escape by killing their guard, traveling hundreds of miles back to the Ohio River, swimming across it to safety. But he did fight during the Revolutionary War. He's very famous for having gone to New Orleans to procure powder for the American cause. He joined in the defense of western Pennsylvania, and also was at Washington at Braddock's defeat, not one of the highlights. But in 1806, he was killed by Native Americans, and the family became under the protection of Colonel William Pope. And the Pope family is pretty famous here in St. Genevieve. Some of the early, one of the early leaders of the town was named Pope. They would have 3 children: Mary Ann Linn in 1793, Lewis in 1795, and William in 1797. Unfortunately, Nancy would die as a young girl, not Nancy, Mary Ann would die at age 9 when she was traveling back from Washington, D.C. And Nancy herself would die in Kentucky in 1807. And I think one of the DAR chapters is named after Nancy Ann Hunter. I think it's in Cape. I mentioned his half-brother, Henry Dodge. He was pretty famous. He was once accused of treason because he and John Smith T were involved in the Burr conspiracy. They got down to New Madrid and found out they were accused of treason, and so they came back, and supposedly Dodge beat up about 9 of the jurists, and that was the end of that problem. But he was also, he was a major general in the War of 1812, having had a company gathered here in St. Genevieve. Later would serve as a colonel in the Wisconsin Territory, and in the Black Hawk War. He actually started the 1st Cavalry Unit for the United States Army, the 1st Dragoons. And in that 1st Dragoons was a guy named Jefferson Davis, and also a guy from St. Genevieve that became another U.S. Senator and would later get arrested for corresponding with Jefferson Davis during the Civil War. But he was one of those guys that came from the asylum. George Wallace Jones. So Henry Dodge was elected as one of the first senators from the state of Wisconsin. And at the same time, his son, Augustus Caesar Dodge, was also seated in the Senate from Iowa. It's the only time a father and son have sat in the U.S. Senate at the same time. We've had other father-son types of that, but that's the only time. His sister, Mary Ann, married a guy named John MacArthur, and his home is still standing here. It's been restored by the Hoffman family. MacArthur was very famous because he was involved in one of our 2 duels. Some of others have described it as a street fight, but he and Linn were walking up the street. They were brother-in-laws from down at the house, which is just on Main Street in Gabbery, and he had gotten into an argument with one of the DeMunn brothers, of which there were 3, and a gunfight kind of ensued. They ended up in the Old Brick. The shot rang out, and MacArthur came out. DeMunn did not. So he had one of his sons, Joseph Hunter MacArthur, graduated from West Point in 1849. And William Pope MacArthur, here's that Pope name again, graduated from the Naval Academy. And he's pretty famous for having surveyed, he was a surveyor, the Gulf of Mexico in 1840, and in 1848 he began the survey of the whole west coast of the United States. So that was a pretty good thing. I mentioned Augustus Caesar Dodge. Well, he served in the Iowa Territorial Delegation from 1840 to 1846, and he was one of the first 2 governors or senators from Iowa. He later became the minister to Spain, and he wrote a book about his life and everything, and so it's pretty interesting. There's a story in there that I'm going to kind of relate later. So Lewis Linn marries a lady named Elizabeth Ann Relf, which also was a political family around here. John Relf was from Virginia, brother of James H. Relf, a congressman from Missouri. And she marries Lewis Fields Linn July 1, 1818. Now, Linn had been a soldier during the War of 1812 with his half-brother, and he'd come back. He went to school originally in Transylvania, Kentucky, and then he went back to Philadelphia and went to medical school, so he was back here in St. Genevieve. And she stood by his side for her whole lifetime. And after he died, she wrote a book, The Life and Public Times of Louis Fields Linn. And it's probably a slanted look at her husband that's pretty good. In 1845, after the senator had died, she was proposed to be the postmistress at St. Louis. But as one friend said in Washington, the cabinet had concluded that the administration of such an important office would not be consistent with her delicacy of character. I bet she could kick butt. She dies December 3rd, 1861. And like I said, she published The Life and Public Services of Dr. Louis F. Linn for 10 years as Senator of the United States from the state of Missouri. She was proud of her husband.
Yeah, she was.
And I mentioned they had three children. The only one we have a picture of is Jane, the one that died at age 9. And actually, Henry Dodge was with Mrs. Linn on their way back from Washington, D.C. when they had stopped in Cincinnati and Jane got sick. William will marry the second daughter. She marries a guy named John T. Barr here, and then eventually he dies and she marries Dr. Peter Fielding Brown in Virginia, and she ends up dying in Virginia. William, on the other hand, served in the military from 1847 to 1848, and he was once arrested for participating in a duel in St. Louis. St. Louis had lots of duels on Bloody Island. We had a couple here. We have one documented one and one sort of, and one street fight. So, but he became the collector for the Port of St. Louis in 1853, dying in 1859, and he's interred in Bellefontaine Cemetery. One of the things when he died, it was in December 27th, it was pretty cold. So they temporarily, and the river was frozen over. Back then it froze over quite a bit. And so they didn't bring him down to St. Genevieve for 6 months. So he was interred in the Leavenworth tomb in St. Louis for 6 months and then came down here. That seems to be a characteristic of the family, which I'll explain later. Louis wanted to be a doctor from early childhood. He studied medicine under Dr. Galt of Louisville and was here visiting in St. Genevieve when the War of 1812 broke out, so he joined his brother's company. It's said when he came back from the war, he was in ill health. It kind of really ruined him. But he went back to study at the medical college in Philadelphia and soon established a practice here in St. Genevieve. And he became known as one of the most caring, popular doctors and respected doctors that St. Genevieve had at that time. He partnered with a guy you heard earlier today, Ichabod Sargent, who owned the Delasue Kern house. His house was actually in town. If you know where the old wood mortuary is, across from the German or the Lutheran church, there's a stone building inside that stone building that was the Ichabod Sargent house. One of the things that the Felix Valley House site has is a doctor's journal of Linn and Ichabod Sargent. And this happens to be a page where he was providing services to Ursule Guibord, the widow of Jacques Guibord. And she's having some of medicine for some of her enslaved children. There's some purges in there, some of the good kind of doctoring that they had back then. But one of the neat things in that book was, this is medical insurance 1827. So for Dr. Linn, I think what it says here that for $25 or so for the whole year, he provided medicine and doctoring to his family. And people said that he had a large press in his house, that he had all kinds of clothes because he would get indigent people in there, he would take care of them. We know that he bought pigeons from Mrs. Vital St. Jean Beauvais to make broth for the patients. One day a wine merchant who lived near the doctor said, "Do your family use all the wine your husband sends for the sickly season? I should think he would have enough to bathe in, but I believe every drop of it goes to the sick who are not able to procure for themselves." So as I said, he was looked on very kindly here in St. Genevieve. Only problem is when you get old, you can't turn pages. Okay. So somebody else mentioned earlier today, cholera. Asiatic cholera started in India and it progressed via ships over to the United States. There were two very violent cholera episodes in Missouri, one around 1833 and the one in 1849 in St. Louis was really bad. Transmission was by drinking contaminated water or infected food, and the symptoms were, excuse me, since we ate a little earlier, diarrhea and vomiting, sick, cold, skin cold but victim feels hot, great thirst, burning in the stomach, tongue and breath cold. Sounds like a morning after a good night on the town. Well, the first pandemic in the far west was around 1816, 1826, but then it started really here in 1833. There were 9 deaths in St. Genevieve in 1 week, so that was quite a few during that time. Linn himself would be stricken with cholera, but would survive. But he really became famous for the treatment of cholera. And he kind of had an unusual thing. I'm not sure doctors today would prescribe this, but as typically they would bleed people to half of a pint, administer calomel, a grain of opium, that always helps, or 30 to 40 drops of laudanum, yeah, or some spirit of camphor, sweat the person, allowed to drink weak tea by the teaspoon. At least he tried something, but he was pretty famous. One time, one of the stories is that they forbade people from steamboats dropping off sick people at the wharf in St. Genevieve. But one steamboat did, and Dr. Linn and his assistant went to get the person, and a crowd gathered around their house and was going to burn it down and not let him come back. And Mrs. Linn stood up and said, well, he's, delivered your babies and helped you when you were sick and everything. And so that's part of the book that she wrote. And they finally let him come back. I think the guy died, but he didn't, Linn didn't get it at that time. So this is the Linn house. It doesn't look this good right now. It needs restoration. Linn bought it from Abraham, it was originally built by Abraham Neufeld, and he had bought the lot from Parfait Dufour in 1806 for $350. Neufeld sold the house and lot to Ferdinand Rozier for $2,000 in 1820. And one of the worst deals, I guess, that a Rozier ever had, he sold it to Linn for only $1,000. I've never known the Roziers to not make money on something, but this was one time. But it is a great house. It does need to be restored. I know our ex-mayor, Dick Reminger, owns it, and I think he's trying to get historic tax credits and do all that, but we hope it's brought back to its former glory. So Linn decides doctrine's not the only thing he wants to do. He starts to get into a political career. He starts locally, becomes a justice of the county court in 1828. Now we have county commissioners that run our county. Back then we had 3 judges and a presiding judge, so that is what they had then. Then in 1830, he joins the Missouri State Senate, and that's a sketch we have of the state capitol at that time. And in 1832, he got involved in the land commission claims. If there was one thing that impacted the French after the Americans took over, it was, were my claims from the French and the Spanish going to be good? And so he worked on that for a number of years, and he would resign that when he became a senator for the United States Senate. But he kind of became a senator in an unusual way. He wasn't elected at first. The guy that was serving in the Senate, this is what Washington looked like in 1833. Nice big lawn in front, there's pastoral scene, there's people kind of walking around, and you still see the cupola on top. But he replaces a guy named Alexander Buckner, who was from Cape Girardeau and who contracted cholera and died. And so Linn was nominated to replace him. One paper wrote, this appointment is probably as judicious as one the governor could make from his own party, and we presume that it will give general satisfaction. The Missouri Intelligencer wrote on November 16, 1833, we believe Linn's appointment will be acceptable to the people of the state, not because there are not many other gentlemen more competent for the discharge of the duties of the office than Dr. Linn, but that is as good as the material in the hands of the governor permitted him to make. I don't think the Intelligencer was working on the same political party that Senator Linn was in and the governor. Linn was a Jacksonian Democrat, and he was very often associated with Thomas Hart Benton, one of our first senators, Old Bullion. Actually, this was a painting of Linn that I'd never seen before. I discovered it earlier this year from a museum in Oregon. And there's a reason it was out there, which we'll get to. The Intelligencer called Linn a supple tool of Benton, and then later reported a quarrel between Benton and Linn. Others' eyes wept, and every groan they heaved with big horror that they would have an argument. The Missouri Argus, who's definitely on the other side of the political spectrum, said there was not the slightest difficulty, and life went on. So, one of the unique things, I had mentioned Jefferson Davis when he was in the 1st Dragoons, and he was at the University of Transylvania in Louisville, and he once helped save Jefferson Davis's life. It happened in the winter of 1837. Dr. Linn, Allen Davis, and I guess it was Augustus Caesar Dodge went to a large party in the West End. Dr. Linn about midnight said, "I'm going home." He was not feeling well. So Dr. Linn and I left. Dr. Linn and I were soon in bed, and a short time later we heard the stentorian voice of Allen coming up the hill. They entered Dr. Linn's room. Davis was without a hat, the blood, mud, and water dripping down over his pale face. Dr. Linn dressed his wounds on his head. Davis went to bed, got clean, dry clothes, and they took him into his room and put him to bed. The next morning, Dodge went in to see him and see if Davis would be ready for breakfast. He found him unconscious, ran back and told Dr. Linn, who took a bottle of ether, one of camphor, and they commenced proper application and rubbing. In short order, he was restored to consciousness. They said if Linn hadn't done that, Jefferson Davis would have died. So a little connection to St. Genevieve we don't normally hear about. So I said that Linn was kind of a gentle person, well-respected and everything. But very early on in his career, he took on Senator George Pondexter. He just said something really nasty in a committee and called out the senator, Poindexter, and he was ordered to put down and get back in order. He remarked to Henry Clay once, he heard Henry Clay say, "Come, let us leave these damn scamps." Linn immediately stepped up to Clay and said, "You are a damn bully and a blackguard." This surprised everyone since Linn was known for his gentlemanly dignity and courteous demeanor. Clay sent Senator Crittenden to see Linn the next day to see if he could smooth the feathers, and Linn said, "No, I'm still mad." He was so well liked and well respected in the Senate. One senator once remarked, he said, "It would save time in the Senate if Dr. Linn would list the bills he was considering, put them on a pile, and say, 'These bills are Dr. Linn's for the benefit of Missouri, and thus them pass, as they surely to do.'" It was seconded by Clay. So, I mean, I wish our senators could do that today. We could be in pretty good shape. So, some of his accomplishments in the Senate. He worked very hard with Senator Benton to pass legislation through Congress that authorized the Platte Purchase. If you look over on that map on the left, you can see that red on the left. That was not part of Missouri originally. And it was, I think, a straight line down. And so somehow they ended up buying that and making it a part of Missouri. Unfortunately, it forced the removal of several tribes residing in that area. One of his most persistent works is trying to bring Oregon Territory into the United States. In an 1818 agreement with Great Britain, the Oregon Territory was open to occupation by both British and United States citizens. In 1838, Linn introduced a bill to organize it under American law, and he proposed to offer each settler a 640-acre grant of land, and he put measures before the Senate to calling for military occupation of the region, construction of a fort on the Columbia River, and military protection for settlers en route to Oregon. And for that reason, it didn't happen in his lifetime, but he would become called the father of Oregon. Some of the other things he did during his senatorial career was he was the chairman of the private land commissions. He couldn't get away from those, trying to figure out those land commissions, and it took a long time to settle all those things. He was the chairman of the agricultural committee, and he did a lot of resolution of French and Spanish land claims, frontier post roads, forts and military roads, improvements on the Mississippi, planting of tropical plants in the United States, manifest destiny and settlement of the West. He was also instrumental in the purchase of Mount Vernon to save it, and for defending President Jackson, who was not always very popular. So I'm kind of getting back after, this is in 1843. He had been in the Senate for 10 years, and he awoke one morning with a violent start. He said, "Dear wife, did you hear that?" She assured him she had not heard anything, and that all was quiet about them. He said, "You are under a great mistake, for I heard distinctly a voice say, 'Prepare, Lewis F. Linn, for this year thy soul shall be required of thee.'" He insisted he had not been dreaming. The voice he had heard was so loud as to awaken him from a deep sleep. He requested her to look at the watch and see what hour it was, then to take his daybook and write it down that had happened. And yes, Linn did die that year in 1843 in October. He died of an aneurysm. Some books say he died of cholera. It was an aneurysm. And the papers all over the United States talked about Senator Linn and his dying and passing. We'll get to his burial in a little bit, because that's probably the most interesting part of the story. But Linn's replacement in the Senate was a guy named David Rice Atchison, and who is sometimes called U.S. President for a day. President Polk had signed his last piece of legislation and said, "This closed my official term as president." March 4th, that day, was a Sunday, and the incoming president, Zachary Taylor, said, "I'm not going to do it on Sunday. I will do it on Monday." So Atchison was supposedly next in line, and so he served for a day before the president was sworn in. Now, scholars kind of debate this back and forth, that maybe Atchison himself wasn't in office, so maybe we went a day when we did not have a president of the United States. So let's get to accolades. He was called Missouri's most beloved. He was called Iowa's senator because he really helped them become a state also. And his friends, Augustus Caesar Dodge and William Jones, were up there. He's called the father of Oregon because of his work with Thomas Hart Benton to have Oregon become part of the United States. And he was called the handsomest man in Missouri. I always wanted to do that. Oliver Hampton Smith in 1858 said, "In person he was about medium height, strongly made, broad, deep chest, full breast, expanded lungs, round head, black hair, beautifully curled over his head and around his forehead. Features perfect, white, beautiful teeth, eyes coal black. He was a ripe scholar." That's a pretty good testament. Crittenden said there was a kindliness and benignity about him, like polished armor, turned aside all feelings of ill will or animosity. He had political opponents in the Senate, but not one enemy. I think that's a great eulogy for a person. So he's recognized because there are 4 counties in the United States named after him. Obviously in Missouri, it's not where Linn, Missouri is. It's up in the north part of the state, and its county seat was a town called Linnaeus at one time. It was called Linn, and then they changed it to Linnaeus. And some say that it's named after the botanist Linnaeus, but Linn himself, there's letters where he was the one that requested the change. He didn't want it to be named after him, or Mrs. Linn did. Linn County, Oregon was in 1847. It's called Albany as the county seat there. There's one in Kansas, right in the, kind of on the Missouri-Arkansas border. And the other one is up in Iowa. There's towns named after Linn. Linn, Missouri, obviously. Linnaeus, Missouri. Actually, it was formerly Linnville, and then they changed it. Linn, Kansas. And then West Linn, Oregon. They just, few years ago, they celebrated their 100th anniversary, and we sent this presentation similar to this out there. And then Linton, Oregon is named after Senator Linn. He even got a steamboat named after him, and it traveled from like Glasgow, Missouri, down to St. Louis. It had regular passage. It only lasted a few years. Evidently, traveling on the Missouri River was about as more hazardous than traveling on the Mississippi River. A lot of steamboats crashed, burnt, exploded, that sort of thing. But I think this one had, if I remember right, it had a special safety feature on it to keep the boiler from exploding, and they advertised that. So I said, you know, he says Missouri's most beloved. The first attempt for the Congress to memorialize Linn came in, I think it was around 1848. Clardy, who was from the Farmington area, he proposed a committee to form that consider making a state appropriation for the erection of a cenotaph for Linn. And he submits the bill for Linn. Gibson then proposed an amendment that the county collectors in each county try to get money to do this. That didn't really fly, so they said, okay, we're going to just make a painting of him and put it in the state capitol. We don't know if that ever happened because the state capitol burnt in 1913, and we don't know if that ever happened. Yeah, on February 11th, 1852, they introduced a bill to erect a monument to the memory of Lewis Linn, and it was amended by Senator Young to add the words, "and David Barton." So here's one party saying, I want this memorial for my guy. David Barton was another Missouri senator earlier, and that's what they did. And that was approved in 1852. The St. Louis Republican, and the reason this picture here, this is an 1848 sketch by Seth Eastman of Little Rock Landing. And it's the earliest painting or drawing we have of Little Rock. But the papers reported that the monument will be 80 feet in height and 18 feet at the base. It is to be built of St. Genevieve marble. The site is 1 mile above town at a point known as Little Rock, on a high bluff, about 150 feet above the river, in a little knoll of trees visible for 30 miles around. The vault is to be blasted out of solid rock in 1/4 acre, handsomely enclosed by marble columns and a chain fence. This didn't happen. They concluded saying that who lives beneath these mosey stones, the answer will come, one who deserves well of his country. So the Detroit paper didn't think much of St. James. They said it was 1 mile north of St. Louis. So David Barton, like I said, was one of the first 2 Missouri senators, chaired the Missouri Constitution group. He dies penniless in 1837. The city of Boonville, where he died, raised money to have a monument built for him, and it was in City Cemetery, now called Sunset Hills Cemetery. And a few years later, in 1853, they established Walnut Hills Cemetery in Walnut Cemetery in Boonville, and they decided to move him. They didn't want him in the old cemetery, so they moved him. In 1855, the legislature authorized $400 for a new tombstone, and it was 20 foot tall. And in 1899, the Sunset Hills tombstone was moved from the Walnut Cemetery to, does anybody know where it's at? Anybody recognize this? We got any Mizzou grads here? Francis Triangle or Quadrangle? Yep, it's still there. So when they did Barton's tombstone, they also did one for Linn. You can see what they wrote on the sides there. Missouri's model senator. And Mrs. Linn had wanted a tombstone, but she didn't have enough money to put, he didn't leave her with a lot of money. So this is the one that the state had built by a guy named Dufresne from here. And later, Mrs. Linn is buried next to him in that smaller tombstone. And this is when it gets interesting. Well, when they first appropriated the money, they didn't have enough to finish it. And so they appropriated some more a couple of years later to build a fence around it. And you can see that fence in this picture. We still have pieces of that fence, not all of it. And they set up a commission to make sure that their money was really spent on the tomb. So one of the problems we had here in St. Genevieve was that once cemeteries were closed, and even sometimes while they were in existence, and the Memorial Cemetery was closed in 1881, and by the turn of the century, well, even earlier, in 1875, this is one of my favorite articles. Some guy wrote into the paper and he said, "One very discreditable feature of our town is the lack of care taken of some of the graveyards. The palings, wooden fencing, or a large portion of them are torn off. The gates are frequently left open, and hogs and cattle are allowed to tramp promiscuously over the last resting place of the dead." They also talk in another article about heifers wandering through the cemetery and hogs wallowing in the mire over the graves. So the state legislature around the turn of the century, about 1905, said, you're going to have to move them. So in 1905, they go in and they dig up Senator Linn and Mrs. Linn and take them and move them out to Cresslawn Cemetery. And while they were digging up Mr. Linn, there was a cherry tree, a wild cherry tree over his grave, and it started weeping drops on the workers there. And it made the St. Louis papers, I think it was from the St. Louis Republic. The Republic said, "Weeping as in grief at the termination of its long guardianship over the grave of Missouri's best beloved. The great wild cherry tree that overspread the tomb of Senator Lewis Fields Linn dropped large drops of moisture like tears of sorrow, fell night and day upon the spot where the dust of the statesman had here rested for 60 years. It's a wonderful story. The Pomeroy Foundation goes around Missouri putting up little things about legends, and so we have a legend about this one of the weeping tree. There are other articles of other trees weeping in St. Genevieve at the same time, so I kind of discredit this thing that it was only for Senator Linn, but it's a great story. And that's how legends are born. So this is his tomb out in the new cemetery. It was right in the middle. There was a circle. It was, he and his wife's grave were surrounded by the fence from the old cemetery. And you can see we didn't take good care of that either. So in 1935, or 1938, in 1935 we had this big bicentennial celebration. We were celebrating 200 years of St. Genevieve, getting back to that 1735 legend of our farming. But a little bit after that, they decided they're going to move Senator Linn back because we had kind of improved Memorial Cemetery. We hadn't made it a swimming pool like the Legion wanted to do, and a few other things, a park. So they decided to move Linn back and his wife. And on the way back, he was in a metal coffin. There was a plate at the top, and this plate opened up, and there is a piece of glass. And you can see inside, he was mummified. You could still see hair, clothing, his bow tie. They described his shirt. They let the kids out of school. They let the priest come up and, as one of my friends said, smoked him with incense, even though Linn was a Methodist. I guess he got that. One of the incidents was that a wagon driver came by, jumped over the fence, went and took one look at him, and went back and jumped back over the fence. I was trying to find people that had actually seen this event or been to it. Some lady from Chicago wrote me and said, I didn't get to go, my brother did. And when he got home, Mom had made chocolate pudding, and he said, you know, Dr. Linn looked just like your chocolate pudding. So I gave it to him. So Linn actually has been buried, and his wife had been buried 3 times. But all in all, when I look back, Senator Linn is probably one of the most wonderful creatures that was here in St. Genevieve, a caring doctor, caring individual, very respected politician, and a prominent citizen of Missouri. And we really should get his house restored and bring it back to its traditional structure. So that's my presentation. Couple of things. I think I have one more slide. Oh, yeah, our annual Deja Vu Spirit Reunion is coming up October 26th from 5 to 7:30. We have about 20-25 people that portray characters buried there. John Oram has traditionally played Senator Linn. I always wanted to do it because he's the handsomest man in Missouri, but John is moving, so we're not going to have a Senator Linn this year, but I'm working with a lady to see if she will portray Mrs. Linn and give a perspective of her husband or talk about her husband from her perspective. So I think that will be a good thing. And also another little commercial. If you're in town tomorrow and you want to hear something about the Germans, I'm going to give a talk on German influences on St. Genevieve, which has been a major influence because we're probably more German than French now, but that'll be at 1 o'clock at the Oris, and it's free. And the last thing for me is if you know anybody that is interested in giving presentations here, working on research, let me know, or the foundation. Next year's conference will be a co-conference with the Center for French Colonial Studies. And it will be here in St. Genevieve, and it will probably be the last week of September. We're working on trying to firm up that date, but that'll be a really good conference, really focused on the French influence in our area that went well beyond the Spanish time, back to the French, and way into the American time. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for coming, and Bob did mention we're probably more German now than we are French, but we were French first.
That's right. And more importantly.
Again, thank y'all for coming, and it was great to see such a great crowd here today. And as Bob mentioned, we do have the Deja Vu Spirit Reunion coming up October 26th, 4th Saturday in October. Rain date would be for the following Saturday. If you haven't made it to a spirit reunion, it's really a neat event. So we'd like to see you there. Also, a couple other events we have coming up. We have a second year, our Holiday House Tour. This is a touring of private homes in St. Genevieve in the historic district. And we are going to be adding a house that's not in the historic district. It just happens to be my house. It's out on 32 of the Plank Road, and it has a great history connected to the Plank Road. And my wife does a wonderful job decorating it for the Christmas holidays. And that'll be the last stop. Also, don't forget about our King's Ball, the first Saturday in February. We have a list of events in your packet, so please take this with you and take a look at it. And again, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next year.